Emmanuel Seeger had never been fond of his first name. His parents, for some reason, were into biblical names, which accounted for his. By the time he was old enough to care about it and complain, it was too late. He was stuck with it. He couldn't fall back on his middle name either, because his parents had blessed him with yet another biblical moniker, Peter. He didn't want to go by Pete Seeger, lest his friends think his parents were old beatniks or hippies. At least they hadn't named him Bob. As a result, he went through life known as Manny. It wasn't great, but it beat the alternatives. Of course, this isn't a story about names, but sometimes it's good to get to know a bit about the main character in the story. Regardless of what people called him, Manny had been captivated by stories of hidden treasure since he'd been young. Tales from 1001 Arabian Nights had grabbed his attention at an early age, even though he'd known they were just fables. Stories of pirates hiding chests full of gold fascinated him as well, particularly because he'd learned that pirates really existed, which meant that perhaps their golden treasures existed as well. He liked movies about hidden treasures, such as the one about King Solomon's mines, and films about El Dorado. Those movies, however, never seemed close enough to reality to get him excited about finding real treasure. Plenty of people had pursued those leads, and all had returned empty-handed. There was, however, one story that captured his imagination. Maybe it was due to his parents' insistence that he take a role in the church's annual Christmas pageant, in which he'd snagged the role of one of the three kings. He, naturally, played the part of the king bearing the chest of gold. As he grew older, and his fascination with hidden treasure grew, he noted that nobody ever talked about the gold that had been presented to baby Jesus. What had happened to it? It seemed obvious that Jesus never spent it, so where did it go? That caught his attention. The other thing that struck him was that it seemed like a waste of time to look for the same treasures everybody else was looking for. There was a lot less competition in looking for the hidden treasure of Jesus, so that's what he decided to pursue. Of course, one of the problems with that course of action was that there weren't a lot of clues. As hard as he searched, and he was a very dogged researcher, he couldn't find anyone who gave the hidden treasure of Jesus a thought. Although he wasn't what you'd call a religious person, Manny went back to the one source he knew that mentioned the gold that had been brought to Jesus as a child, the Bible. Interestingly, only the Gospel of Matthew recorded the visit of the wise visitors from the East. Undeterred, he read Matthew's account repeatedly in every translation he could find. Despite his best efforts, he failed to find any new clues. What was he missing? The texts he read clearly described the gift of gold being given to the infant Jesus, along with gifts of frankincense and myrrh. Manny wasn't interested in recovering old spices, which had surely rotted away, but he knew that gold wouldn't deteriorate, even after a couple of millennia. But if he was to unravel the secret of the missing gold, he was going to need help. A fair amount of online research led him to someone he thought might be able to point him in the right direction. It was a retired biblical archaeologist who lived one town over from him. He was generally regarded as the most brilliant biblical archaeologist in the United States. He wasn't always popular with the most fundamental members of the evangelical community because he was such a stickler for scientific evidence. even when that evidence he found didn't provide the answers that some of them wanted. Of course, the scientific community didn't really accept him either, because he refused to rule out the possibility of things beyond the current scope of science. Knowing the professor's reputation, Manny was a bit hesitant to approach the esteemed expert with a tale about the lost treasure of Jesus. But after reaching Professor Simon Gelden at his home, Manny found him surprisingly willing, even eager, to talk, and made an appointment to visit him later that day. After a short exchange of greetings and small talk, the professor smiled at Manny and said, "How can I help you with the questions you have on your mind?" For some reason, Manny felt quite comfortable telling the professor that he'd always been interested in lost treasures and that he found it odd that no one seemed interested in tracking down what happened to the gold given Jesus as an infant. He explained how his own research into the gifts of the three kings had left him completely unsatisfied. The old professor smiled again and said, "My friend, first you have to know the difference between what you know and what you don't know." Great, thought Manny. I need answers, and I get the Cheshire Cat. Of course, what he actually said to the professor was, "Tell me what you mean." "Let's start with one of your assumptions," said the old man. "Why do you assume these visitors were kings?" They weren't kings. They were scholars, wise men, and people who studied nature, including the stars. Their knowledge and wisdom caused those in power to seek them out for advice. None of the biblical texts suggest that they were kings. They were actually kingmakers. Now let's consider another of your assumptions. Why do you assume that there were three of them? Manny blurted out, "Everybody always talks about the three kings. I'll accept your explanation that they might not have been kings, but some people refer to them as three wise men. Heck, I even played one of these wise men in the church pageant when I was a kid. But are you telling me there weren't three of them?" "Oh, there could have been three of them," responded the professor with a thoughtful look. "But it could have been 5 or 7 or any number of magi who were at the stable." Why do you think people assume there were three? Do any of the translations you've read actually say that? Manny sat in silence for a moment thinking. He closed his eyes to think carefully about what he had read. Suddenly, his eyes flew open. Gifts! There were 3 gifts. I've always assumed that because there were 3 gifts, that there were 3 people presenting them. You're obviously not the only one who thought so, chuckled the obviously amused professor. Now that you have a better understanding of who the Magi were, let's turn our attention to the gifts themselves. I'm sure you can tell me what they were. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh, blurted out an increasingly excited Manny. But to be honest with you, I'm more interested in the gold than in a bunch of spices that surely rotted into dust a long time ago. Of course, you're right about the gifts, replied the professor, and as a treasure hunter, your assumption about the condition of those gifts is probably correct as well. But it behooves us to take a closer look at these three gifts. Why would someone present a baby with gold, frankincense, and myrrh? I do remember doing some reading about that, replied Manny. Frankincense and myrrh were both highly aromatic spices. Both were used to anoint people. Frankincense supposedly represented holiness and royalty. Myrrh, on the other hand, was often used as a spice to prepare a body for burial, right? Correct again, acknowledged the professor. What you may not know, however, is that those spices, by weight, may well have been worth more than the gold the child received. Still, they seem like odd gifts to give an infant, don't you think? Manny was silent as he thought about the professor's comments. The professor then continued, "Let's think about the gold that has you so interested. How was it presented? In what form was it given?" A puzzled Manny thought for a second before saying, "I always assumed it was gold coins or something of that nature." "Are you suggesting it wasn't?" "Ah, you're seeing the problem with making assumptions now, aren't you?" said the professor softly. "I'm not saying it wasn't gold coins or gold nuggets or something like that. The fact is, we have no evidence one way or the other. All we know is that gold was given. Let me ask you why you think it might have been coins." "Well," said Manny thoughtfully, "all the pictures and images I've seen have always suggested a chest full of gold." "And when were those paintings done?" asked the old man. "Did Joseph and Mary happen to have a painter commissioned for the occasion?" "No, of course not," replied Manny. "And now that I think about it, even the earliest paintings of the scene were done many centuries later, and would have reflected the thoughts and ideas of European artists." "I agree," said Simon. "Once again, the assumptions we make, without evidence, by the way, can lead us to conclusions that may or may not be accurate." "So do you have a theory, or at least an idea, of what form the gold was in?" asked Manny. "I do indeed," replied the professor. "But before I tell you what I think, we need to examine something else that we haven't discussed yet. It may not seem relevant, but I think it's key to understanding the whole story. How did the Magi find the infant Jesus in the first place? Manny replied, "Well, the biblical narrative talks about them following a star. And you confirmed that they were astrologers, or at least observers of the stars. So that seems to have some validity." "That's true," said the professor. "But have you ever heard of a star behaving like the one described in the biblical narrative?" "I'm no astronomer, but I've never heard of a star doing that. And if it had really been observable in that way, why did others not see it? Surely there were other stargazers looking at the skies in those times. Would they not have seen and reported such an incident?" "So what do you think it might have been?" asked a confused Manny. "That is, if it wasn't a star." Professor Geldman laughed. "This is the kind of thing that gets me in trouble with my scientific colleagues. It's speculation, of course, but I think it's something more than that. I don't think science has answered every question yet. We're learning more all the time, and we've got a good system for challenging our hypotheses. But we haven't figured out everything yet. Call it a leap of faith, if you will, the professor continued, but I think it was something that looked like a star. Keep in mind that not everyone saw it. There are no historical or scientific records of a star behaving in such an unusual manner, moving and coming to rest over a particular place. And this phenomenon was viewed by a very small group of people, none of whom were scientists as we understand the word. What in the world looks like a star but isn't a star? Asked Manny. Perhaps something not of this world, came the astounding reply. My hypothesis, dare I even suggest my belief, is that it was angelic in nature. Stars don't move across the sky, at least not in the way that the biblical narrative suggests this one did. A bright and shining angel, on the other hand, could lead a band of stargazers across thousands of miles. Manny stared at the old scholar in amazement, unable to speak for a moment. Does my hypothesis surprise you? Asked the scholar. I have to admit, it surprised me. But it also suggested to me the form that the gold might have been in when it was presented to the infant. It may have been an ornament of some kind, fashioned in the likeness of a star. Of course, continued the professor to his still dumbfounded listener, that still seems a rather odd gift to give to a newborn. What is a baby going to do with expensive spices that are pretty much used for ceremonial services? Or with a gold bauble? What practical use do these gifts have? Are you suggesting, said Manny, who had finally found his voice, that these gifts were symbolic? Symbolic, yes, replied Geldman, but also very real physical items. As you suggested earlier, the spices would have long ago been consumed or turned to dust. The gold ornament might have survived, but we're really not talking about a treasure trove of gold. Finding something like that would be like searching for the proverbial needle in a haystack. The gifts were an acknowledgement of who the child was and would become. They were a confirmation, a powerful but easily overlooked statement of the nature of the child. There was silence in the room as the two men reflected on what they had just discussed. Finally, Manny broke the silence with a question. Are you suggesting that I give up my quest for the lost treasure of Christ? Not at all, replied the wise professor. I'm merely suggesting that you may want to refocus your search for treasure and rethink your understanding of what treasure really is. Remember, not all that glitters is gold, and not all who wander are lost. Wandering can be a form of seeking. Keep seeking. You may be surprised at what you find.